This Acts 1:8 verse that Alex shared with me as the foundation of where we would begin reads this way: "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Now, when I was coming to faith in my late teens, much like Pastor Charles, I don't know what was happening in the late 70s, early 80s. There was something in the air because both of us were coming to faith, thanks be to God. But as I was coming to faith, I took great comfort in this story. I saw in this passage and much of the early book of Acts this beautiful picture of Jesus' followers miraculously spreading the word about the arrival of the Messiah and together giving birth to this church, which had become so profoundly meaningful to me. It seemed to me to be a story about the church peacefully moving from strength to strength, about faithful Christians sharing the message and in their own families, with their own friends, with their neighbors and co-workers, and about the church organizing to spread itself worldwide. So, fast forward about 40 years, 35 of which have been in vocational ministry for me, the last 17 of which have been with this organization called International Justice Mission, or IJM. I will go more deeply into the work of IJM in a few minutes, but for years, many of you at Burke Community Church have known about IJM because you've been generous supporters of our work in Ghana, which is another reason I'm grateful to be here, just to say simply thank you. Thank you for being part of the community that supports the work of IJM. But for those of you not familiar with IJM yet, we basically, in the name of Jesus, protect people in poverty from violence. That is what we do. In places in our world where people are being trafficked for labor or for sex, where kids are being abused in front of webcams, where women and children are living under the threat of daily violence, where police are abusing their power to steal the livelihoods or the very lives of those they're intended to protect, this is where we work. And over the next 8 years, our intention, by the grace of God, is that in 24 countries, in 46 specific jurisdictions, again, by the grace and power of God, we are seeking to protect 500 million people from this kind of violence. I'll talk much more about how that works. But over the last 17 years of my work with IJM, I have been exposed to some of the darkest things that you can imagine in today's world. And now, when I look back on this passage after 40 years, I do see a beautiful picture of Jesus' followers miraculously spreading the word about the arrival of the Messiah and together giving birth to the church. But that's not all I see. These days, I see more than just that. Particularly after 20 years almost of working with IJM, what I see now also is a courageous group of Christians pushing through chaos, rising to challenge, embracing conflict, and confronting violence. Now, let me recast these images for you just in the context of early Acts. Imagine how chaotic it was for these beloved disciples trying to recover emotionally and spiritually from the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, which happens just over the course of a few weeks. Right? What's happening at the Passover with Jesus being tried and then executed and then the resurrection, that's happening at Passover. And what happens at Pentecost, those two events are only 50 days apart. Right? So imagine the tumult and the chaos that is happening for the beloved disciples as they're living through these 50 days. Imagine the challenge of trying to digest all that Jesus taught over 3 years and turn it into sermons that meaningfully interpret and amplify the old covenant in a way that inspires and informs a new covenant. Imagine that mental challenge. And then imagine that when you finally begin to get a hold of that and the hang of it a bit, that thousands of new members are added to your community, sometimes in a single day. So of course there's rejoicing, but then there's logistical challenges like crazy, especially in this community that is sharing a purse and caring for the poor. This is going to be chaotic. Imagine the conflict that arises when religious and political leaders become threatened by both the message and the movement that is arising in their midst. And then imagine the impact of that violence as it begins to arise and leaders are jailed and beaten and ultimately murdered because of this movement. By Acts chapter 7, we have Stephen preaching a powerful sermon that goes all the way back to the Old Covenant and reviews the whole thing as it proclaims the reality of Jesus the Messiah and locates him in the context of the Old Covenant to deliver this truth about who Jesus is. This sermon is so powerful that there seem to be only two reactions to it. People either want to join the community or they want to kill Stephen. Both of these things happen. And it's the stoning of Stephen, this gruesome act of violence, that ultimately leads to the words that open chapter 8 of Acts. Chapter 8:1 of Acts says this, "And Saul approved of their killing him," killing Stephen. "That day a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria." That's Acts 8:1. Acts 1:8 was the promise from Jesus that they would go through Judea and Samaria and ultimately to the ends of the earth. But it's an act of violence that perpetrates the scattering of the church, and only the 12 stay in Jerusalem. I don't think any of the people that heard Jesus' original promise imagined that it would be fulfilled this way, in the midst of this chaotic act of brutal violence. And I'm here tonight to tell you that this is why living the gospel matters. This is why living the gospel matters, because the world that we are called to live in is a world that is fraught with chaos and challenge and conflict and violence. So this is why we as a community must begin by living this gospel out together. The work that Jesus invites us into will, without a doubt, bring us into contact with breathtaking beauty and inspiring hope. There is no doubt about that. But it will also, without a doubt, bring us in contact with darkness and suffering. When I talk with our iJam staff, there are 1,400 of us around the world. When I talk with our iJam staff about the reality of this kind of chaos, challenge, conflict, and violence in the story of the early church, they're actually comforted by it, by the reality that that's true, that's been true of the world for 2,000 years, because that's what they're experiencing every day. It has a familiar ring of truth to it. So I want to take you on a little journey this evening that I think will demonstrate why the idea of knowing and sharing Jesus together, or as Pastor Charles said, why the idea of doing the gospel together is a first principle and the vital beginning place for meaningful spiritual missional formation. So, over my 17 years with IJM, I have found myself in some strange situations over the years, and I want to pull you into one of them tonight. So I want you to imagine this. We are sitting together. It's evening. You might be feeling just about as tired as you are now. It's about this time of the evening. We're in a small hotel room in a city called Cebu in the Philippines. It's the second largest city in the Philippines. And there are about 25 of us crammed into this room. It's not just like a single room. It's like a little bit bigger than that, but it's not huge. And we're all crammed in there together. There are 12 investigators. They are professional investigators. Some of them are lifelong Christian law enforcement. Some of them are IJM investigators, and there are 12 of them. They're going to work in pairs that night, and they're getting prepared to go out to do that work. I'll tell you what that is in a second. There are 6 handlers who are going to make sure that those pairs of investigators get to all the places that they need to get to, and they're going to track them and make sure that it's sort of like an overwatch or a security system. Make sure that they end up where they're supposed to be and that they get out and that they move on to the next thing. They're just going to track where they are. And then there's another set of 6 people that are just going to be gathering data. They're going to stay in the hotel room, which we're calling the command post for now. And they're going to receive phone calls periodically from these investigators, and they're going to gather data and put it in a spreadsheet. Here's what's happening. The team has been working in Cebu for the last 4 years, and they've been rescuing children who've been trafficked into brothels for sex. Now it's time to see what the effect of that work has been. So we're going to send these pairs of investigators out into 6 to 12 brothels every night for about 6 weeks. They're going to go in pairs. They're going to pretend to be people who are throwing a party over the weekend and who need to find the youngest girls they can to come to the party. They want to rent them, so to speak. So I know this is a hard story. Bear with me. So they have all the information they need. They have a Google Map overlay of the 6 to 12 different establishments that they're going to go into. Their Overwatch person knows what that route is, and they're going to make sure that they're okay. And the data handler is going to be back at the command post taking all the data into the spreadsheet. So they're going to go into the brothel. They're going to need to look like they belong there. They're going to have an assumed name. They're going to have a story about this party that they're throwing over the weekend and why they need young girls there. The younger, the better. And they're going to sit down. They're going to drink a beer because they need to not stick out, and that's what everybody else will be doing. And they're going to talk with the sex workers. They're going to banter, and they're going to look like they belong. Imagine what that's like, right? So they're preparing to go out and do this. But the whole time that they're there, what they're actually doing is counting. Counting, counting, counting. Every sex worker they see, and working as hard as they can to identify anybody that looks like a minor. If they spot someone across the room that looks like a minor, they will work very hard to approach that person and to engage them in conversation, because she will have been taught to lie about her age. So they have various ways of actually talking with her about birth signs and things like that to get her to reveal what her actual age is without any challenge directly, but to gently get a sense of what her age actually is. So the whole time they're in there, these professional Christian people are going to be counting all the sex workers they see and looking to identify minors, because we're looking to see the overall effect that our 4 years of work have had in metropolitan Cebu in the Philippines. So that's the setup. We're all in the command post together. We're jammed into this little room. It's dark out now. It's time to begin this work, and they're all going to head out. But before they head out, everything stops. Everything's done. All the map overlays are handed out. Everybody's been handed out the operational, petty cash, so that they can do their beer and all that kind of stuff. And everything stops, and all eyes turn to you, because it's time for devotions. Here's my question. What do you say? What do you say in that context to these investigators who are going out? What do you say to the Overwatch people? What do you say to the people who will be sitting in the room all night gathering data? Yes, we can confirm that this is indeed a commercial sex establishment. The following acts are available at the following prices. Oh, let me enter that in a spreadsheet. We counted 36 sex workers, and we identified 0 minors, and we're moving on to place number 4. We're going to do it all again. What do you say? I want to promise you that by the end of this talk in a few minutes, I will actually answer that question based on how I acted in those moments, what I said. But I wanted to begin here because I want to articulate why it is so important that we together live the reality of this gospel. Because the world that we are in contains these realities. The world that we're in is a place of breathtaking beauty. And I can tell you, I think tomorrow in some of the breakout sessions, I will get a chance to tell you some of the stories of shocking beauty that we have encountered. But it's a beauty that's found in the midst of chaos, challenge, conflict, and violence. This is why we need first to live the gospel before we try to tell others about it. I'm aware that not all of us are called to engage in this kind of investigative work, and perhaps this sounds like an extreme example, but I want to begin here because I want to drive home that point. No matter what it is that we are doing in service and faithfulness to God, God doesn't invite us to serve Him in order to use us up, right? You could hear that story and think, ooh, how long are those people going to be able to do that? And then they'll have to go and do something easier, right? But our premise at IJM has always been, if God has invited us into this work, then He's not done it to burn us out. He's done it for some other reason. No matter what role our service to God takes, no matter if we see ourselves in ministry or industry, for profit, not for profit, the truth is that God invites us to serve him in order to give us life. Of course, we know this in our heads, but it's so easy to slide back into believing that our ministry or our service or our obedience is something we are doing for God. Especially the hard stuff, whether it's in our workplace or our personal lives, sometimes we end up thinking that burnout is just the cost of doing business. Perhaps we can serve God in these really hard places for a few years, and then maybe we'll need to step aside for a while and recover. You'd be forgiven if you thought that about how this works with our IJM staff. But according to Jesus in John 10:10, Jesus says it's the thief who comes to steal and to kill and to destroy. But Jesus comes to bring life, abundant life. And that's a good thing too, because some of the commands that Jesus lays out are pretty challenging. He invites us to take up our cross as we follow him. He invites us to consider others' needs as more important than our own, to seek first his kingdom before any other kingdoms. And this world that Jesus sends us into is a world of chaos, challenge, conflict, and violence in the midst of all the beauty, of course. Consider for a minute the passage that Jesus reads as he transitions into his earthly ministry. You remember this. He shows up in the synagogue in Nazareth one day, and he sovereignly reads from the prophet Isaiah. We have it recorded in Luke 4:18-19, but he's actually reading from what we know as Isaiah 61. And he says these words. Imagine Jesus walking in, unrolling the scroll, and saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." Bring good news to the poor, right? No, don't get up. Let me bring it to you. Bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then to make it all the more riveting, he says, "Today, by the way, in your hearing, these words are being fulfilled." What? Like hair on the back of your head stands up. This is a challenging clarion call from the Messiah. And perhaps it's no surprise that Jesus chooses a reading from the prophet Isaiah for this occasion. The great prophet is as direct as he can be about this aspect of God's command for all of God's people. Way back in the first chapter of Isaiah, he says it with stark clarity. The prophet says, "Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." Now, for much of my early Christian life, these passages were just not preached on very often. And when they were often treated as abstractions. My hope is that the story I'm pulling you through this evening will be a story that helps bring these to life, these passages to life, in a very, very concrete way. So keeping that story about the command post in the Cebu hotel room and what the investigators are heading out to do, let's try to hold that in mind as I tell you about a young woman named Jay Pearl. Jay Pearl's growing up in the Philippines, and she's the oldest of 5 children, and she feels a very strong burden to help support the family. And so she finishes her education at age 12, and decides the best thing that she can do is go and get a job so that she can help keep her younger siblings in school. So the best options she has are a few hours away from her hometown, so she travels, and she takes on work as a maid. And she's working very hard. She gets a second job in the evening, but she's just not making a lot of money. It doesn't seem super sustainable, especially because she's trying to take classes at night at the same time to continue her own education. So when she sees an advertisement for a better paying job at a spa, she jumps at the chance. She gets 2 interviews. They're oddly sort of careful interviews, and then she's hired, but her employer forces her to sign a contract saying that she would not provide sexual services to clients at the spa. Which is strange because as soon as she starts working there, the manager himself begins to arrange for customers to pay him extra for the privilege of abusing Jay Pearl. So now, Jay Pearl, along with other minors who are at the same spa, is undergoing repeated sexual assault from client after client. After her first month at the spa, J. Pearl is paid the equivalent of $7.25, a fraction of what she was promised, and barely enough to provide food and necessities for herself, and certainly not enough to help her support her family and her younger siblings. And the whole time, J. Pearl is kept in a boarding house about 50 meters from the spa where their managers could keep an eye on her and make sure that she showed up for work. What would Jesus say about J. Pearl's situation? What would the prophet Isaiah say about J. Pearl's situation? Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Again, I know these kinds of stories can be hard to hear, but I want to invite you to pick all that up and carry it with you for a few more minutes. The investigators in the command post, J. Pearl's situation, and these challenging commands of Jesus, because we are actually on a journey of hope together. In the face of all this, let me show you what IJM has been seeking to do for the last more than 25 years. First, what IJM is doing is looking for victims like J. Pearl and seeking to restore and rescue and restore them. We're seeking to bring criminals to justice, like the spa owner who is abusing J. Pearl. And we're working to scale the demand for protection and ultimately to strengthen justice systems so that people like J. Pearl cannot be abused in the first place. Everything that's happening to her is illegal. It's just that no one's enforcing the laws against it. This is what we're seeking to do in the world, and this is where in the world we're seeking to do it. And our goal, as I said, over the next 8 years is that through this work, by God's grace and by the power of Jesus, we would see 500 million J. Pearls protected from violence. 500 million people in poverty. 500 million sounds like a lot, but it always comes back to real people, real children like J. Pearl. By God's grace, it turns out that rescuing the one is possible. J. Pearl, around the same time that she was lured into the spa job, IJM was conducting training with local law enforcement professionals on investigative techniques and evidence collection techniques that would lead to such rescue operations and that would get J. Pearl out of her nightmare and children like her. So this was part of this brand new operation that we were running in Cebu in the Philippines, the location where the command post is, right? This is just a few years before we all show up at the command post. And it turns out that local police were eager actually to put this IJM training into action quickly. And with IJM support, they conduct an operation that resulted in J. Pearl's freedom. Our IJM aftercare staff were able to come alongside J. Pearl, provide trauma-informed care so that as J. Pearl began to heal, she was actually in a position to testify in the trial against the spa owner who abused her so brutally. And to me, this is one of the most beautiful reversals of power that we get to see in our world today, in the IJM world, where we go into a court of law and J. Pearl, as part of the process of her own healing, is able to tell her story in a place where that story actually matters. So, that's not all we were after, though. We knew about the J. Pearls, and we wanted to rescue as many of them as we could. Our Cebu operations over 4 years had a series of relatively small program goals over those 4 years. We hoped we'd see about 100 rescues of kids like J. Pearl. We hoped we'd accomplish about 75 arrests of people like the spa owner. And we hoped that some of these active prosecutions that were happening would begin to go to trial and that we'd get the first few convictions at the end of the 4-year program cycle. And as it turned out, over the 4 years, we exceeded those goals. By doing all this, we had a grand hope. We did exceed. We rescued about 128 kids over 4 years, which again doesn't sound like a lot. We had about 100 arrests that happened, and the first set of trials were beginning to come to completion. And that was at the end of the 4 years. So with the donor that made all this possible, we had gone on this wild, hopeful, faithful tear to say, hey, we think if we can do this over 4 years, what we'll actually see is a 20% reduction of the number of minors available in the sex trade in the Cebu in the Philippines. And we felt if we could accomplish that, that would be a miraculous thing. So we run the program. We have this experience of hitting all those numbers and actually exceeding them, even though they seem small. And then when it came to the time to do this measurement in Cebu, in the Philippines, the one I told you about at the beginning, we didn't find a 20% reduction. What we found was a 72% reduction of the numbers of minors. Amen. Praise be to God. Hallelujah. And the Philippine government says, wow, this is amazing. Where can we go next? So we move on to Manila in the Philippines. And we run, you can move to the next slide. And we run to, we see the 72% reduction in Cebu. We go to Manila with the Philippines government. We do the same kind of process. It ends in a 75% reduction. And then we move on to Pampanga, which is in the central Philippines. We do the same 4-year process, and we see an 86% reduction in the number of minors. Now, all of these measurements are taken by the method I started describing. It's an actual count done by human beings. Investigators posing as pedophiles looking for underage girls, and the results of this research are verified by third-party criminologists. Now, I did have the unique opportunity of companioning these investigators on these assessments. One of those trips, on one of those trips, my young teenager asked me what I was going to do as we were headed to the airport, and I explained the process of the investigators and the command post and all of that, and her comment after a moment of silence was, wow, that sounds soul-crushing. And I'm here to say it sure could be. But my IJM colleagues around the world are followers of Jesus, doing this work out of faithfulness to God, the God of justice. They're doing the gospel together. And our God of justice offers some pretty amazing promises to those who faithfully follow Jesus into this work. Let me jump quickly back to the prophet Isaiah for just a second. By the time we get to the 58th chapter of Isaiah, speaking for God, the prophet lays out what is in store for those of us who will seek justice on behalf of vulnerable victims like Jay Pearl. Here's just a sample of what the prophet says. If we will do this, says the prophet, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and the Lord will say, here I am. Just pause for a second over these extraordinary promises. If we learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow, then our healing will spring up quickly. The glory of the Lord will be our rear guard. We will call and the Lord will answer. We will cry for help and he will say, here I am. Because of these promises and the full testimony of Scripture, it is our full expectation at IJM that while this work will be hard, while it will involve real suffering and trauma, if we engage in it in partnership with Jesus, if we live out the gospel together, what we will actually encounter is the abundant life that Jesus promises. Let me say again, if we engage this challenging work in partnership with Jesus, what we will actually encounter is the abundant life that Jesus promises, a life of meaning and purpose and joy. So, in order over the last 25 years to engage this work in partnership with Jesus, what we have done since the beginning at IJM is we have adopted a robust set of spiritual practices that all our staff engage in together. For 25 years, IJM has built in these rhythms of spiritual formation on a daily, quarterly, and annual basis. All of our staff around the world, all 1,400 of us, participate in this idea that in this community that shares a simple set of disciplines together. These spiritual rhythms form what is called a rule of life in the IJM workplace. Because we're all Christians, we do this together. So, every workday begins with 30 minutes of silent prayer. You show up in your workspace, if that's your office, some of us are working remotely now, but the first 30 minutes of the day are for prayerful preparation. So I'm going to do whatever I need to do to spend those 30 minutes in God's presence, contemplating what I'm headed into that day and what I need from God. Where do I need wisdom? Where do I need love? Where do I need joy? Where do I need peace, patience, kindness? Where do I need to see the fruit of the Spirit? What am I in the midst of that is way too big for me? Where do I need to see God come through? So that's the first 30 minutes of the workday. Then we'll get to do some work, and then all of a sudden the work will be interrupted again by a call to corporate prayer. And a few hours into the day, all the offices will stop working again and gather together in the biggest space that we have in whatever the office is, and we'll spend 30 minutes praying together for the work. That's an hour a day devoted to prayer in every IJM office around the world. And then once a quarter, we're going to pull everybody away for what we call a quarterly prayer retreat. And we'll spend some time studying the character of God together. We'll have some worship and a little bit of preaching about the nature of who God is. This year, we're studying peace. What does it mean to be people of peace in the midst of this challenging work that we're doing together? Jesus said he wants to give us peace. What does that look like in the midst of conflict and challenge and violence? So that'll be a little bit of teaching, and then the centerpiece of that quarterly prayer retreat is going to be 2 hours of silence. We're going to pull everybody together and then send them off separately alone to spend time with God. Then we'll come back together and we'll chat a little bit about, have some lunch, chat a little bit about what we're learning, what we're hearing from God. And then we'll send everybody home a little bit early to have a nice, slow weekend. That's a quarterly prayer retreat. And then once a year, we'll ask all of our staff to take a personal retreat day, a day where they can go off and think back over the year and just recognize the places where they've experienced God, or recognize the desolations in the year. Where did I deeply long to experience God? In my own transformation, in the work that we're doing together, in my family, and I couldn't quite access that. And I can talk with God about that. I can pick up some things, maybe some themes, and carry them into the new year with me. And we ask all of our staff to do that, a personal retreat day. We are blessed at IJM with generous donors who love to give us money to ensure that this non-work time is actually protected in the midst of the busyness. If you add up all this time, the way IJM staff around the world are spending this time in spiritual formation activity, what this means is that every IJMer is spending roughly 14% of their work time engaged in spiritual formation, pursuing Jesus. 14% of their work time. This ensures that before we're trying to show or tell anyone else about Jesus, we are a community. We as a community are knowing and sharing Jesus with one another. It's been a powerful experience for me. I will say I came to IJM 17 years ago after 20 years in vocational ministry, and I have never been in a community that is as committed to spiritual disciplines as this community. It's been transformational for me. So, thinking back to that hotel room in Cebu, the command post, the first thing we need to remember is that all of those staff are already living in this robust rhythm of daily, quarterly, and annual meaningful engagement with Jesus and with one another. That's the first thing. And the question I posed at the beginning was this: in that situation with the investigators at the command post and all eyes turned to you because it's time for devotions, what do you say? Well, what I want you to hear from me tonight is this. What you may say in a moment like that might be helpful, but perhaps even more helpful are going to be the rhythms in which you and the team live during that challenging work season. What rhythms will we adopt together? Because in my experience, hear me out, in my experience, what these investigators need during these challenging weeks of work is really not all that different from what you and I need every single day. What do you and I need every single day to remain faithful to Jesus in whatever work we have been given? It's a baseline of knowing and sharing Jesus together. So as I share what we do in these situations at IJM, I want to invite you to think through these elements in your own life. Which of these things have you found helpful, and which ones might sound intriguing to try, right? So we have those 4 baseline elements of beginning the day with 30 minutes of contemplative prayer. What do I need from God in order to engage my day today? We have some time during the day where we're praying with trusted believers about the things that have become too hard or too heavy for us, or the places where we've seen God show up, and we want to acknowledge that together. So that's an hour a day right there. What do those practices look like for us in a sort of day-to-day life? Is there a quarterly space that that we can go to that will give us this luxurious couple of hours to slow down and enter into the presence of God in a deeply meaningful way? Is there once a year where I can get away? I know in various life phases this can be hard, but just once a year, could we get away and find enough time and space to reflect back for a little while and to reflect forward for a little while, all in the presence of the God who loves us? I think those are our baseline. Those are the things that we've chosen to do in the midst of like regular work days. But then when a study like this is happening in Cebu, we're going to do a few extra things. So here's how I answered that question. When all eyes turn to you and they say, how should we live? What do we need to know as we go out into these brothels tonight? Our approach would be to set up a specific rule of life that governs how we live and work over the course of these weeks, and it's based on a few simple elements. First, we must establish healthy work and rest rhythms, even in this extreme situation. So we've got 6 weeks to do this study, but we're not going to work 24 hours a day, and we're not going to work 7 days a week. We're going to be really careful to say, even in this extreme situation, we're going to take one whole day off to rest. We're going to take a Sabbath. We're going to protect a Sabbath in this. I mean, in normal life, like we all get a weekend at iJam, like that's a real thing. But in these situations where this kind of project is going on, we're still going to protect one Sabbath day. And we're going to start work at a certain time, and we're going to end it at a certain time, so we're not constantly on high alert, right? We're going to think carefully about how it is that we roll in and roll out of work. 2, and I think this is where the words come in, we're going to work really hard to keep reminding ourselves of what is true. If you're going to go that deep into a chaotic, dark place, you're going to need to continually remind yourself of what's true. Because, for example, a brothel system is built on a network of lies. There are lots of lies. Lies like the girls really want to be there, or sex workers are actually interested in their clients. The names that you are exposed to are all fictitious. Nobody's using their real name. Nobody's using their real age. It's all lies. Simple truths can be really helpful. So the words that I say in those situations are things like, there is nowhere you will go tonight where the Spirit of God does not already dwell. Helpful to remember. There is nothing beyond the redemptive reach of the Maker of heaven and earth. Helpful. God knows the name of every single person you will talk to tonight. He knit them together in their mother's wombs. Again, helpful, right? And there are lots of ways you can do that. Remind yourself of what's true in the midst of the world's lies that would try to assert that they're true. 3, and this may be surprising, don't take yourself too seriously. If you showed up at the command post, and I wish I could invite you to one, you'd find a lot more laughter than you would expect. And that's by design, right? We're just not going to take ourselves too seriously because actually the weight of this work doesn't belong to us. It's the God of justice who is on the hook for these results. We're just going to do for today whatever we're called to do, like children of the living God who are just adorably going out about the tasks that we've been given for the day. And then finally, there's more I will say about this in the breakout sessions tomorrow, but we're going to consciously roll into the work, right? So the work day is going to start a little later in the day, 4 or 5 in the afternoon. So we're going to have time for rest and things before that, and we're just not going to be in work mode all the time. So we're going to consciously roll in. And then the last thing that we're going to do as the investigators come back into the command post at 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning, they're going to do several things. They're going to check in with their data handlers and make sure all the data is straight and clarify any questions that they have so everything in the spreadsheet is accurate. They're going to turn their petty cash back in so that we can dole it out the next night. And they're going to make sure they're going to check off all of the places that they got to so we make sure that we're moving forward on the program. Then, the very last thing that they will do is they will gather with the data handler who will finally get up from the spreadsheet. They will have their Overwatch person come and join them, and the 2 investigators, and will all stand in a circle. And they will use something that's called, in the intercessory prayer world, that's called a cutting away prayer. Well, they together will pray this very simple liturgy that allows them to put down the work, to acknowledge that God sees it all, that God is the one who's responsible for it all, and that ultimately God will get the glory for this work that is being done. We'll close that out, and then we'll go to bed. We'll wake up, we'll get some rest, we'll wake up, we'll maybe play a little bit, maybe have some exercise, and then we'll start the next day again. Most of my IJM colleagues will tell you that their time at IJM has been a surprising time of spiritual growth. Many of my IJM colleagues will tell you that their time at IJM has been one of the most significant catalysts of growth that they have experienced in their spiritual lives. And I think this is why. It's the combination of rhythms of spiritual formation that are lived out in the context of really challenging mission. It's these two things that we've been talking about all night, right? It's right belief and right practice. It's living the gospel and sharing in it together and responding to the call of the gospel as it engages the world in its places of suffering. Again, in my breakout session tomorrow, I'll talk a bit more about these simple spiritual disciplines and how they invigorate our lives at IJM. And if you want to join me as a first step in this, I want to invite you just to begin praying with us. We have a simple way for you to do that. You can scan this QR code, or we can give you what the URL is, what the website is, but it'll take you to a website where you can sign up, and once a week, we'll just send you a set of prayer requests. Hey, here's what's going on for us. We would love for you to join us in prayer. And there's a simple step that you can take actually to step into this world with us, to engage with the God of justice, to be a person who is both living the gospel together here at church with us in the IJM community and being part of taking the gospel out with us as well. So I want to encourage you to do that. And then one more thing. It's been a bit of a journey, I think, tonight. And I want to acknowledge that some of what's been shared is just hard to hear, right? You've been in your own way, or we have been in our own way, on a similar kind of journey that an IJM investigator might have been on through the course of a night of work. And so if you're willing, I'd love to invite you to pray with me that investigator's cutting away prayer. You can sit comfortably, you can stand if you like, if that's comfortable for you to do. And I'm just going to pray this prayer over us as a way of saying, hey, we have been drawn into this world. We have seen some things that are hard to look at, even just in hearing the stories, right? But ultimately, this is God's responsibility. So we can put these things down in the midst of our own, when it's time for us to go home tonight and actually get some rest and then come back tomorrow for the next day. So why don't we do this standing if you're comfortable doing that, because that's how our folks are using this prayer. And you imagine it's the end of a long and challenging night of work. Maybe this has been a long and challenging night for you as well here. And you're standing with people that you have been living out the gospel with, people that you have taken risks for because Jesus has invited you to do so. You've done the counting, maybe you've entered things into the spreadsheet, maybe you've been tracking the petty cash, maybe you've been part of the overwatch, but we're all participating in this together. So just take a deep breath, and then exhale slowly. Let your shoulders relax, let your body relax. Remind yourself that God is here with us. That there's no place that you can go that is outside of the redemptive reach of this kind God. And then pray this prayer with me. Kind Father, thank you for commissioning me into this ministry of rescue and deliverance. I have answered your call this night. Even as you left the light of heaven to dwell in the darkness of earth, I have followed you deliberately into a kind of darkness and evil from which most righteous people are taught to flee. I have seen with my eyes, heard with my ears, touched with my hands, a kind of suffering and despair that is more than my humanity can bear. O God of light, by your mercy, dispel this darkness and speed the dawn. May all those who now lie beyond my reach remain in your watchful, tender care. And as this day draws to a close, I leave all that I have seen in your gentle hands. Lift from me the burden of sadness, fear, and despair that weighs me down because of my work this night. Where I've been tempted to anger, lust, or hopelessness, fill me instead with your joy, love, and peace. And receive especially these images that cling to my heart, soul, and mind. Just take a moment to call up any image that might feel stuck inside of you and just release it to God. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I step now out of darkness and into light, acknowledging that in you there is no darkness at all. I step now out of my assumed role into my truest self, acknowledging that you lovingly knit me together in my mother's womb. I step now out of work and into rest, acknowledging that you neither slumber nor sleep. Protect me and my family from all sickness and harm. Bind the enemy from all influence and authority in our lives. Renew us with your power, your love, and your joy. In the strong name of Jesus. Amen.